about a little over an hour, we will be hitting sundown, Shkiat נחמה, which will usher in Rosh Chodesh Av, Rosh Chodesh Menachem Av, as we like to call it. Perhaps the difference between whether we call it Rosh Chodesh Av, which has very, very somber connotations, because it tells us that it's the month of Tisha B'Av, Mishenichnas Av, Mima'atim B'Simcha, as the Mishnah says. When the month of Av enters, we reduce all kinds of things of simcha, of joy. There is an opinion in the amongst our chachamim that I'll say at the outset is not lahalacha. It's not binding at all, but at least just to clarify a point, it's important to know that there is an opinion that says that when we talk about the week of Tisha B'Av, Shavua Shechal Tibot Tisha B'Av, which would be next week from Sunday until Thursday would be Tisha B'Av. So after Tisha B'Av, basically we go back to normal. Now it's true that in the Ashkenazi ritual, we carry it over till the next day, the 10th of Av, and that's because of the opinion in the Gemara of Rabbi Yochanan, who said that if it would have been my opinion, I would have made the whole fasting in commemoration of the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, not on the 9th of Av, but on the 10th of Av, as it says so explicitly in the Tanakh that the Churban, the destruction, was on the 10th of Av and not the 9th of Av. But we observe it on the 9th of Av, as you know. But in Ashkenazi ritual, we carry over until noontime the next day. This year, because the 10th of Av happens to be on a Friday, so we have a little bit of a leniency, and that is we do not have to wait until noontime, but first thing in the morning on Friday, all of the restrictions of the 9 days are actually relaxed, and one can already engage in bathing, in laundry, and everything that we don't do in the 9 days, we can already do in the 10th of this year on Friday morning, and not have to wait till noontime. And noontime for this purposes is about 12:45 in the afternoon. The only thing that's left that lingers on until noontime, even this year on Friday, is the prohibition or the customary prohibition not to eat meat or drink wine. But I don't think most of us have wine and meat for breakfast, so it's really a mood issue. But that does carry on until noontime on a Friday. The opinion that the Gemara tells us that I said is not lahalacha, it's not binding, states that not only is Shavua Shechalbo, the week that Tisha B'Av falls out in, the days prior to Tisha B'Av that carry with them all kinds of restrictions, but it also impacts on the days after Tisha B'Av. For example, if Tisha B'Av happens to have come out on a Tuesday, so according to this opinion, so Shavua Shechalbo would be Sunday and Monday, and Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Both ends of the week of Tisha B'Av would be considered Shavua Shechalbo Tisha B'Av, the week that Tisha B'Av fell out. But again, we have not adopted that opinion, and from our point of view, Tisha B'Av ends the period of the mourning of the 3 weeks, except for this little carryover to the 10th of the month, 10th of the month of Av until noontime the next day. But the rest of the week, for sure, we do not have to concern ourselves. And this means that when we say Av, we're talking about the mourning period, the somber period, the sad period, and so on. If we call the month Menachem Av, we throw in the word consolation, it gives the month of Av, and specifically Tisha B'Av, a somewhat of a different taste to it, a different understanding, a different feeling. And that is that in spite of it all, Am Yisrael is looking forward to a moment of נחama. And our Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik always pointed out, and I've stressed this in the various talks on Kinot in Shul on Tisha B'Av, that the day of Tisha B'Av itself is split into two, until Chatzot, until noontime on Tisha B'Av, and then there is a feeling of somewhat relaxation of the strictness of Tisha B'Av from the noontime hour until the end of the day. Certainly it expresses itself in shul, because in the morning we're still sitting on low benches and we're not wearing talit and tefillin. The parochet of the Aron Kodesh has still been removed, and all the trimmings of like sitting shiva are still there in the morning. However, when we move over to the afternoon, and all of a sudden at mincha time, we're putting on talit and putting on tefillin, we're sitting on regular chairs, the spirit of mincha in the Kriyat Torah and the Haftarah is so radically different. It all speaks of a future movement of Am Yisrael, a moment of consolation. So Rav Soloveitchik pointed out that we think that the moment of consolation begins with Shabbat Nachmu, but actually it begins at noontime on Tisha B'Av itself. And when we refer to the month as Menachem Av, as we traditionally say when we do Birkat HaChodesh, as we did the past Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, Menachem Av Yeh Biyom HaRevi'i, we're thinking very, very optimistically. Now this can impact on another custom, and that is on the Shabbat of Birkat HaChodesh of Av or Menachem Av, however we refer to it. Do we say the Avarachamim immediately before Ashrei by Musaf? Now, Avarachamim is a type of Yiskar. It's a collective Yiskar for the great communities of Am Yisrael that were decimated. Kilot HaKodesh shemasru et nafsham al Kedushat Hashem. The Avarachamim was composed at the end of the 11th century in the aftermath of the first pogrom in the First Crusade in 1096. And we have in the book of Kinot several elegies, Kinot, that speak about that particular event. And indeed, there was what to cry about. The great communities of spires, of Mainz and Magensia, that they were obliterated with many of the great scholars, Talmidei Chachamim, of those areas. And to that end, we mourn on Tisha B'Av as well. So no doubt, there is some room to consider saying the Avarachamim even on the Shabbat of Birkat HaChodesh of Av. Now, that precisely is the opinion of the Vilna Gaon, except that most of Am Yisrael has a different take on this, and they say, no, it's Menachem Av. And we're going to put the Evel on the side, the mourning on the side, and we're going to look a little bit more optimistically, and we're going to delete Avarachmim as we normally do on Shabbat of Birkat HaChodesh. Now this plays itself out as well in the two occasions that we have Birkat HaChodesh during the period of the Sfirat HaOmer. And in many Kehilot, as well as in our Kehillah in נחama, we actually do say Avarachmim when we have Birkat HaChodesh for Iyar and Sivan, precisely because in that time framework occurred the tragic events. In one of the elegies, the Kinot that we say on Tisha B'Av, we actually give target dates, the 23rd of Iyar, and then we speak about the 8th of Iyar and the 23rd of Iyar, and then we speak of Rosh Chodesh, Sivan, and then we speak of the 3rd of Sivan, and then the 6th of Sivan, which happens to be Shavuot. These are target dates that many Jewish communities in Europe were obliterated, and there was so much tragedy that how can we just pass the opportunity for a collective Yizkar for Kehilot Kodesh shemasru et nafsham al Kedushat Hashem. I'll just say parenthetically that Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook Zatzal, the famous son of the Rav Kook of great fame here in Eretz Israel, Rav Tzvi Yehuda, Rosh Yeshiva of the Merkaz Rav Yeshiva, after the Holocaust, incorporated Avarachmim in his Shabbos Musaf every single Shabbos. There was no such thing as this Shabbos we don't say Avarachmim. The pain of the Shoah was so intense and so great, he felt the need to say Avarachmim every single Shabbat. But we in our community did not say Avarachmim the past Shabbat, against the custom of the Vilna Gaon, but in line with the custom of the majority of Am Yisrael, and to see things not so much in terms of Rosh Chodesh Av, but seeing it in terms of Rosh Chodesh Menachem Av. And to this end, we'd like to say a few words about national mourning. Now, national mourning you have a phrase that's found in the Gemara Masechet Yevamot called Avilut Yeshana and Avilut Chadasha. Avilut Yeshana means old, literally old mourning, but it doesn't mean old, it means historic mourning. Mourning that takes us back centuries and centuries. Avilut Chadasha means that some tragedy occurred in the family just recently that obligates members of the family to mourn. So that's Avilut Chadasha. The Gemara gives two different nicknames to these two categories. One is called Avilut Drabim, the mourning period of the community, or what I call here national mourning, and that is identified with Avilut Yeshana, historic mourning, and the other is called Avilut Yachid, private mourning period, and that's the Avilut Chadasha, when we talk about the passing of an individual, and the family has to go through the process of Avilut, of mourning. So when we say national mourning, so what are we mourning for in this particular case? Well, you know, the terms Galut and Geula, exile and redemption, are central categories that feature in any discussion of Tisha B'Av and the days that lead up to Tisha B'Av. But I'd like to read a few lines from our great Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik, who wrote on the subject of redemption. So we should understand, to give a little bit of a very nice framework for this. What is redemption, writes the Rav. This is found in an article called Redemption, Prayer, and Talmud Torah. It's been translated to Hebrew, but he gave it as a lecture, of all places, at the University of Pennsylvania in 1973. And I'll just say parenthetically, the Rav did not shy away from invitations to university campuses, knowing fully well that he's going to be facing a crowd, a mixed crowd, people who would be Jewish, non-Jewish, committed Jews, non-committed Jews, men, women of all ages, and he was willing to do it. And he prepared himself for that kind of intellectual encounter. So this article, Redemption, Prayer, and Talmud Torah, the Rav begins by saying that redemption is a fundamental category in Judaic historic thinking and experience. And he raises the question, what is redemption? And his answer is as follows. Redemption involves a movement by an individual or a community from the periphery of history to its center. Or to employ a term from physics, redemption is centripetal movement. To be on the periphery means to be a non-history making entity, while movement towards the center renders the same entity history making and history conscious. It's interesting that this was said by somebody who lived his life in the diaspora, but understood the uniqueness of what the ideas of redemption are all about when it comes to national redemption. So the Rav, in a completely different context, it was a halakhic context about when one begins to say Talu Matar Livracha after Sukkot, and the difference between the Eretz Yisrael community and the Chutz La'aretz community, where in Eretz Yisrael we begin on the 7th of Cheshvan, and in Chutz La'aretz we picked a target secular date of December 5th, which is a shi'ur in itself. Why is that the case? But in a word, the Rav believed that it would be the responsibility of those on the playing on the court, who are running, who are the history-making people, to do the utmost that God should deliver the reins in its time in Eretz Yisrael. However, if we need reserve strength, then we can call on, at a later date, the Jewish nation throughout the world, who are there in a supportive capacity. And the Rav made a comment in that shiur, says this is not just limited to the question of when to say Talu Matar in the Bracha Barech Aleinu, but he saw this in general, that Am Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael, whichever period this may occur, they are making the history, and the Jewish nation throughout the years of diaspora were being dragged along and weren't really creating history. So this is a very, very big difference between Galut and Geula. And because Galut and Geula, exile and redemption, carry with them various examples, which indicates that redemption and exile are very complex in nature. We cannot say that Am Yisrael, the Jewish nation, is absolutely redeemed or absolutely in exile. Perhaps we can say that in Messianic times, when everything is just going to be just perfect, and there'll be the opportunity for fulfillment and a total fulfillment of Torah and mitzvot here in Eretz Israel, with Beit HaMikdash and with the Melech and with the prophets and with. But we're not there yet. But the fact is that the concept of Geula carries with it a phrase, Geula Shlema, which means complete Geula. Once you say Geula Shlema, you are inferring that there could be partial Geula, Geula Chelkit. And indeed, our Chachamim did speak of Atchalta de Geula, the beginning stages of Geula, which means things can be staged, and basically, we could be in a situation where in some realm there already is redemption, while in other realms we are still striving for redemption, and we're not there yet. So partial redemption does exist without a doubt, and our feeling is that we're somewhere in that particular mishmash of day and night of partial redemption and partial exile, as we all know. One of the areas that the Rav spoke about in terms of redemption and exile happens to be the Torah itself. Now, people think that when we talk about redemption and exile, we're talking about the land of Israel, or we're talking about the people, the Jewish nation. It's quite true. The Jewish nation can be in exile. The Jewish nation can be in a redeemed state. The land can be in exile, and the land can be in a redeemed state. But we would not normally think that the Torah also is an object that can somehow be reduced to an exilic state or uplifted to a redemptive state. And lo and behold, the Rav felt it was axiomatic that with regard to Torah, it indeed does take place. So much so that there was a book written by the Chofetz Chaim. Let's just remember the Chofetz Chaim passed away in 1933 at a ripe old age of 97, 98. I can tell you that I saw with my own eyes a clip of the New York Times in New York City. I wasn't there, 1933. There was an obituary in the Times, and it said, Chofetz Chaim 104 dies in Radin. Now, the Chofetz Chaim was not 104 years old. I mean, I actually verified this with people who were acquainted with Chofetz Chaim. He lived to a very old age, and you have to realize in Eastern Europe, to make it to 96, 97, that was an accomplishment, no doubt about that. But he didn't make it to 104, and how it made it to the editorial page of the obituary page of the Times that he was 104. He was an old man. But before he was an old man, he wrote many, many books. The most famous, as you know, is the Mishnah Berurah and the Shmirat HaLashon, on Lashon Hara, and he's written other things as well. But Chofetz Chaim put out a book called A Digest of the Mitzvot, Sefer Mitzvot HaKatzar. And what he has there is, he takes a look at the list of 613, and he goes through a type of sifting process. He says, all right, let's see which of the mitzvot are binding today and which are not. Let's give Am Yisrael a handbook. Now, this could be very, very useful for any Jew, whether a person is completely observant or not, just to have a handbook of the mitzvot that are appropriate. It would be a great book to hand out to a bar mitzvah boy, a bat mitzvah girl, to a convert perhaps, to somebody who's a Baal Tshuva. It's just an excellent work that doesn't bother. You don't bother talking about leprosy, neged sarat, and you're not going to talk about offering a korban chatat and Beit HaMikdash. None of that's there. What do you have from the 248 positive mitzvot? You have 60 mitzvot from the 248. And I think any of us online right now, without doing much thinking, can list 40 of them. Literally, without thinking. I mean, you have Tefillah and Kriyat Shema and Birkat HaMazon and Tefillin, that's already two, and tzitzis and Shabbat and each chag and matzah and sipur yizim Mitzrayim, and you just got you get tzedakah, kibbur aveim. I mean, my gosh, it's not hard to get to 40 at least. And you struggle, you get to 50. But Chofetz Chaim got to 60. 60 out of 248. And with regard to the negatives, and you figure the negatives, that most of them should be enforced, except that there's some that are not. Because if you don't have a Beit HaMikdash, there's going to be some mitzvot that are not enforced. So from the 365 don'ts, only about 245 are enforced. And the Chofetz Chaim, 190 are enforced. 190 from the 365. So what he comes up with is grand total of 250 commandments out of 613. So that works out to about 35% of the Torah. 35% of the Torah. What happened to 65%? That's about 2/3. The answer is it's in galut. It's in exile, waiting for redemption. And I remember the Rav spoke in the 1960s at the Mizrahi conventions, and he would tell the delegates at this convention, if you want to know what religious Zionism is all about, it's the thawing out of the mitzvot that are sitting in the deep freeze for 2,000 years. So we have many, many mitzvot that for 2,000 years were just in the freezer. They had no relevance whatsoever. And now we have been able to, with God's help, take them out of the freezer, thaw them out, and at least on some level, be able to relate to them, whether it's on a rabbinic level, perhaps even on a biblical level, and we constantly are upgrading it. And that's a remarkable step in the right direction of the redemption of Torah. I'll give you just one example. The laws of milchama, of war. The Rambam has 4 chapters in the end of the Mishneh Torah in Laws of Melachim, of monarchy, 4 chapters on war. Chapter 5, 6, 7, and 8. Who is concerned about those 4 chapters in the last 2,000 years on a practical level? I mean, you had great minds, breaking their heads to try to figure out a resolution of a contradiction that the Rambam said this here and he said that there, but nobody was talking what's called halacha l'maaseh, practical halacha. It just was not relevant at all, at all. It's interesting that there's a letter from the Rambam written in the end of the 12th century, stating how saddened he was that Am Yisrael has completely lost the ability to wage warfare. He says, how are we going to be able to go back to Eretz Yisrael if we do not have the military capability? And that was the case for sure in the Middle Ages, whether it was North Africa, where the Rambam was, or whether it was Europe, Christian Europe. Jews did not have the ability to organize and fight and so on. I would dare say that the first time Jews lifted up arms and tried to do something about it was the Warsaw Ghetto. And that's 1943, and so on. Of course, things started here in Eretz Yisrael a little bit before. And today, when we look at the military capability of Am Yisrael today, it's nothing less than miraculous, because for 1900 years, we did not have this ability at all. And came along a giant of Torah in the form of Rav Shlomo Goren, Zecher Tzadik Lebracha, who was the first chaplain of the Israeli army for 24 years. And as Rav Lau Sr. said the eulogy for Rav Goren in 1994, he said that Rav Goren wrote the Shulchan Aruch for the Chayalim. And indeed, those books of Rav Goren on the laws of warfare are still being used till this very day, years after Rav Goren passed away, with each subsequent chief chaplain adding a chapter and a few lines here and there. But it's based on Rav Goren's work. Everything's based on Rav Goren's work. What he did was he succeeded in taking the laws of war out of the freezer and defrosting them, thawing them out, putting them on the table, dealing with them, and interpreting these halachot for practical halacha. This has to do with Geulat HaTorah. Now, on Tisha B'Av, we very much cry, among other things, over the exilic status of Torah. Torah was in galut. When we say Torah, it was in a deep freeze. Torah was clearly in galut. And what's interesting is that their Mishnah in the 5th chapter of Masechet Ta'anit already draws our attention to the fact that when we discuss, or will be discussing, anything that has to do with the 3 weeks and the 9 days in Tisha B'Av, there will be an element of the loss of Torah. And that's how the Mishnah tells us five events occurred on the 17th of Tammuz. The first one is that Moshe Rabbeinu shattered the Luchot. Now, that can be figured out. That date is not given in the Chumash itself in Parshat Ki Tisa, but Rashi does us a favor and figures it out that that's exactly the precise date that Moshe Rabbeinu descends from Har Sinai after 40 days from Shavuot, and the Luchot are shattered. Now, that was an event of the Midbar, of the desert, just shortly after leaving Mitzrayim, not long after leaving Mitzrayim, 7 weeks plus 40 days after leaving Mitzrayim. What relevance does that have to do with the fact that the Babylonians are going to crash through the walls of Yerushalayim, and the Romans are going to crash through the walls of Yerushalayim on the 17th of Tammuz? Why begin the list with that biblical event? And the answer is that the Chachamim wanted to attach to the dates something very, very biblical that really kicks off the spirit of that period. And if you want to know what it was with regard to Shiva Sabar Tammuz, it was the shattering of the Luchot. The shattering of the tablets with the 10 Commandments was the first episode of Galut HaTorah. Torah was steeped itself into Galut. And so too, the Mishnah goes on and tells us of an episode that occurred on the 17th of Tammuz, Saraf Afustamus et Torah. Who is Mr. Afustamus? The Gemara pleads the fifth. Gemara doesn't have a clue. The Gemara says, Gemara. Gemara in this case means tradition. Tradition. We have a tradition that there was some person, it's clearly a Roman name, and there was a public burning of the Torah. And when did it happen? On the 17th of Tammuz, which means that this is an event that is part and parcel of the events that led to the fall of Yerushalayim. Even though a particular isolated event of the burning of a Torah cannot be attributed a contributing factor to the fall of Yerushalayim, it spells out the spirit of what was going on, and that is that Torah took a beating in those generations of Churban. And so too, with regard to Tisha B'Av, there was an attempt to bring it all back to the days of the Torah itself, and says that on Tisha B'Av, that's when the decree of remaining 40 years in the desert fell after the episode of the Meraglim. So we also have an episode of some bringing us back to the Torah itself, giving it some impetus to what happened on Tisha B'Av, kicking the day Tisha B'Av into a focus as being a day of Bechiyah L'Dorot, of sobbing and crying for generations to come. And one of the events that took place on Tisha B'Av was that the final fall of Beitar, which means the Bar Kokhba revolution, come to a most tragic end. And when anybody discusses the tragedy surrounding the Bar Kokhba revolution, so it's not only that we actually had plans to construct the third Beit HaMikdash, and not only did we have for 2.5 years an independent state in Eretz Yisrael with a monarch, with a king. Shimon Bar Kuziba, Melech Yisrael, is found on documents that were located in the various Qumran caves and so on. So we know that this was a full-fledged movement, government, revolution against Rome, and so on. And and Rabbi Akiva believed, and then he convinces the other Chachamim that this is going to usher in the Messianic days. And it all falls. It all collapses. So it's true. The Beit HaMikdash plan is obviously buried, no doubt. The Galut, the exile from the land, actually did not take place after the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. After the Romans destroyed the second Beit HaMikdash, they did not bring about a massive exile from the land. They allowed people to stay in Eretz Yisrael. But 65 years later, in the days of Hadrian, that's when the Galut actually took place. And if you remember one of the more, let's call it easier or lighter kinot, elegies that we say in Tisha B'Av, because it's so beautifully poetic. B'tzeiti miYerushalayim, b'tzeiti miMitzrayim, b'tzeiti miYerushalayim, and it oscillates back and forth. And you get the idea of what we had when we left Mitzrayim, the glory of Moshe Aharon, b'tzeiti miMitzrayim. And then it says, Nebuchadnezzar ve'Andrianus b'tzeiti miYerushalayim. So people ask, one second, Nebuchadnezzar, I understand. He was the one who led to the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. But Hadrian, Andrianus, was not the one who led to the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. So why does that parallel Moshe ve'Aharon? Moshe ve'Aharon says, b'tzeiti miMitzrayim. And Nebuchadnezzar and Andrianus, b'tzeiti miYerushalayim. The answer is that Andrianus was the one who led the galut, the exile from Eretz Yisrael. So clearly the fall of Bar Kokhba and the entire revolution precipitated the exile from the land as well. But the most important feature that we mourn for on Tisha B'Av from the Beitar, the fall of Beitar, was not so much the political fall, which was devastating, not so much the loss of the potential Beit HaMikdash, which was horrific, no doubt, but was the fall of Torah. And the elegy, the kinah that we will say on Tisha B'Av of Arzei Halvanon, where we go through the Asara Harugei Malchut, it says it all. It says it all, how we go through those great Chachamim and Rabbi Akiva leading the pack, who were executed in the most brutal way. This was a major, major fall of Torah. And that in itself is one of the reasons that we continue fasting on Tisha B'Av, because of Galut HaTorah. So much so that 2 generations after Rabbi Akiva's Rebbe, Rabbi Meir, who was the student of Rabbi Akiva, so Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi had some protexia with a Roman friend, Antoninus, and because of that protexia, he was able to get the Mishnah out, to use the modern word, publish the Mishnah, and market it to all of Klal Yisrael. I mean, people already leaving the country. The central halachic authority of the Sanhedrin was caving in. And there would be a necessity for Am Yisrael to be armed and equipped with some type of a text that at least would preserve in a frozen form the oral law. So while there was a biblical prohibition from committing to writing the oral law, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi deliberately violates that law in the spirit of the Pasuk in Tehillim 119, Kuf Yutet, Eit la'asot Lashem heferu Toratecha. Sometimes you have to do something for God by trampling on something in the Torah. And they were perfectly prepared to trample on the halacha that is prohibited to commit to writing the oral law, so that Am Yisrael would have written oral law wherever they may go in the days of the diaspora. And indeed, that was done. And that saved, to a large degree, the Torah. There was at the time of the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, the point was well made in the days of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Ten liyavne v'chachameha, fine, the Beit HaMikdash is lost, but if we could just hang on to some type of skeleton Sanhedrin, Beit Din HaGadol in Yavne, we will be able to continue. And indeed, it did continue for some time, but it did not last. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi provides Am Yisrael with that kind of a text, which was also a type of consolation that we have something in the hand and we'll be able to make it through the very, very long exile. But the fact that the oral law now becomes committed to writing is in itself an act of galut. It's an act of exile. And it's exilic because we lost the ability to bring all halachic topics for discussion in the presence of the 71 members of the Sanhedrin, and they had the sovereign right to legislate and interpret as they saw fit for the particular generation. And we do not have that today. And to that end, this coming Shabbat in the Haftarah, we conclude the Haftarah where while we have the custom of reading Chazon Yeshayahu in the Nigun, the melody of Eicha, we end it with going back to the normal melody of Haftarah, which is exactly the verse that triggered the bracha in Shmon Esrei 3 times a day, the restoration of the Sanhedrin. And because we don't have that possibility, we are in Galut. Now, there are no small amounts of kinot that reflect this tragedy of the loss of Torah. Now, I'll just read from Mi Ten Roshimayim that speaks of the Crusades of 1096. It was written by the poet Clonimus ben Yehuda. And here he speaks of the Torah. Mipaz Yikara umizav chamuda. These are phrases lifted out of Tehillim Perek Yutet. We're familiar with it on Shabbat morning. Kvoda Pnima, Kavod Kol Klei Chemda, the beauty, the glory, the wealth of Torah. What has become of it? Re'itiha, I have seen it. Kru'a, Shchula, V'galmuda, ripped and torn and shredded. What was torn and shredded? HaTorah, V'hamikra, the written law, the Tanakh, HaMishnah, the oral law, Ha'agadah, the philosophical teachings of Chazal, and the weeping and wailing. A Torah, where is the Torah? What has happened with the Torah? Where is the Talmid, the student? Where is the Lomda? Where is the teacher? Without those three, the Torah, the Talmid, and Lomda, you don't have Torah. And this is what the Middle Age poets were weeping. And I remember Rav Soloveitchik pointed out that 3 times in our Jewish history, Torah took a dive in terms of its posture, in terms of its being studied. And the first time was clearly the Bar Kokhba revolution. It really took a dive. And the reaction was that we had to have the Mishnah, as I mentioned earlier, to keep us afloat. The second time was at the days of the Middle Ages and times of the Crusades, and many of the great scholars, Rishonim, perished al Kiddush Hashem, up until the days of Maharami Rutenberg, Morena Meir ben Baruch, and he writes a poem, obviously before he dies, and we say it in Tisha B'Av, Shali Serufa, where we bemoan the burnings of the parchments of Gemara that was done in the 13th century in Paris, outside the Notre Dame Cathedral. We are well familiar with that particular incident, and you have to realize that in those days, a whole city of Paris didn't have more than several copies of Gemara. It wasn't like today. Everybody has a Steinsaltz and a Schottenstein, and if you don't have that, you have it online, and you get an application, an app, and this and so on. Almost there's no excuse any longer for not having some Gemara text in one's Jewish home. Once upon a time, you had a Chumash, and that's what you had. If you were lucky, you had a Chumash with Rashi, and if you're even luckier, you may have even had a Rambam. But most people did not have a full Torah library, and the meager books that were available in manuscript form were burnt publicly in many periods. So Torah took a dive in that period as well. And the third time, the Rav said, was the Shoah. And we know that the Shoah, not only did we lose in excess of 6 million Jews, of which included over 1 million children, which was the future of Am Yisrael. So we lost no small number of great Talmidei Chachamim and budding Talmidei Chachamim. No doubt Torah took a dive at the end of the Shoah, and it must necessarily be commemorated on Tisha B'Av as part of the overall experience of Bechiyah L'Dorot, the wailing and crying throughout the ages. But there's some good news here. and that is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given Am Yisrael the ability to begin the process of resuscitation. So with regard to the land, well, we can go back to 1880. We know that in the history books in Israel, the children are taught about the first Aliyah, and the second Aliyah, and the third Aliyah, and so on. And now some of the historians who are a little bit more honest are recognizing that we have to move the clock a little bit back in history to a little over 200 years ago, to the Aliyah of the students of the Vilna Gaon. We're talking about the president of Israel's great-great-great-great-grandfather, the Rivlins and the Solomons, and they were the ones who came and they remained here. And it's interesting that those who came to Eretz Yisrael in the 16th century, the Kabbalists who came to Tzfat, that Aliyah was not sustained because there were earthquakes in Tzfat and the city was destroyed, and there was no continuity of those communities. But from the Aliyah of the students of the Vilna Gaon, and then some of the Hasidim who came at the same time, those families did take root in Eretz Yisrael, and it can be established that this was the beginnings of what would become the settlement here in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, and then in the 1880s, it began, no doubt, as formal, the Zionist movement began settling the land, purchasing, as you all well know, and it's led to this very, very day. And today we have almost 50% of Am Yisrael here in Eretz Yisrael. I think the numbers are 46%, but it's growing in Mirz Hashem in our favor. So the land is being redeemed. However we're going to look at it, it's being redeemed. There is an element of Malchut Yisrael. I mean, we're not there yet. This is not David HaMelech all over again. Let's not get carried away here with any prime minister, and they'll all remain nameless. But none of them lived up to the credo of David HaMelech. But nevertheless, it's better than nothing. And the Rambam tells that to us clearly in his description of the Second Temple era, where the 200 years we had independence in Eretz Yisrael with the Hashmonaim dynasty, and some of the kings were awful, were really awful. Yet the Rambam believed that that was better than diaspora, being under the yoke of foreign governments. So we have the ability, Baruch Hashem, to run our own business here. We make mistakes. Some things we do wonderfully, some, thank God, miraculously. A lot of good things that are happening here, as you all well know. But perhaps in the area of Geulat HaTorah, we've made unbelievable strides here in Eretz Yisrael, especially since the establishment of the state. And the state, no doubt, is, even though it's not a religious government per se, by definition, nevertheless, the state institutions have promoted no small amount of Geulat HaTorah on different levels, and that has to be appreciated as well. But perhaps I'd like to just focus on some we call actualia, some news here of taking a look at some of the bright things that are coming out of this corona situation that we're in right now. In respect to Geulat HaTorah, redemption of Torah means that a person who's a seasoned Talmid Chacham can rise to the occasion and express an independent and bold opinion. Even though we do not have a Sanhedrin, we don't have that corporate body to take the vote and have that vote become obligatory upon all of us. Nevertheless, even if it remains just on the level and the realm of strong recommendation, it's an indication that there are some Rabbanim who are examining the current situation carefully. And I'm going to name 3 names. I can name many, many Rabbanim who have not risen to the occasion. I prefer not doing that. But I'd like to name 3 names, 2 here in Eretz Yisrael and 1 in Chutz La'aretz, who in my humble opinion have risen to the occasion and offered concrete, sound, halachic advice under the circumstances. The 2 leaders in this area here in Eretz Yisrael, who I refer to this as Geulat HaTorah, redemption of Torah. One is a great Rav from Ramot Gimel, Rav Osher Weiss, and the second is the Sephardi chief Rabbi of Israel, Rav Yitzchak Yosef. Of all people, I'm sure some people are surprised that I've taken him out of the hat and listed him as well. Rav Usha Weiss has listened carefully to the situation in the communities. He's listened carefully to the advice of professionals. He's listened carefully to the Ministry of Health. He's listened carefully to understand the situation. He has consulted with others and not only rendered decisions on his own. He didn't agree with other Rabbanim, but that's okay. But he took the pains to consult with others. And as we know, there are differences of opinion today with regard to the davenings in the yards and people on the porches and people listening to davening on Zoom. Whether you're part of the minyan, whether you can say the Kaddish, you can't say the Kaddish, can you answer Baruch Hu and the Kedusha, what about Kriyat HaTorah? There are all these questions. Rav Usha Weiss did not shy away from rendering halachic decisions. He was on the ball with regard to Pesach questions and subsequent issues that had to be dealt with on a very, very regular basis. The second is one of my great teachers from Yeshiva University, Rav Hershel Shechter, who is the head of the Kollel at Yeshiva University. He has risen to the occasion as well. I think he has written almost 1,000 responsa since Corona started. He's going to put out a book, Shelot U'Tshuvot Min HaKorona. I can see it already. He's got so many tshuvos. I am online with the Rabbinical Council of America. I get the information. So, for example, Rav Shechter writes that with regard to Eicha, let's remember that Eicha is not like reading the Megillah. It's not a bona fide rabbinic mitzvah that you have to have somebody read it from a klaf and that you have to fulfill the obligation through the Bal Korei. Yotzi Moitzi doesn't exist for Eicha. Eicha is a ceremonious reading, and it can be done from a Tanakh book. It doesn't have to be from a scroll. And you don't need a minyan for Eicha. Everybody can read Eicha at home. And because of that, the leadership of נחama, Sherwin and Eliezer Jessensen and other members of the Moitza are going to announce a schedule whereby everyone will be able to tune in to a communal listening of Eicha and the Kinot together. And this is very, very important that we can do this together as a community. And there's no need for a minyan structure for the Eicha. And Rav Shechter advised all the shuls in America that many shuls, by the way, are totally closed in the United States, but they daven in the yards, or they make the backyard minyanim and so on. He said, just daven, Ma'ariv, and then go home and have the community announce a certain time when the Eicha and the Kinot will be done together in unison, and this is what should be done. I'm using this just as an example of something that Rav Shechter talked about. I remember with regard to the days of the Sphira, he was notoriously lenient with regard to people taking haircuts who didn't schedule a haircut when Corona hit and they already needed it, and the barbers were closed, and the feeling was that perhaps after Pesach, the barbers might reopen. So at what point can you already take a haircut? What about shaving in Chol Hamoed for those who don't shave in Chol Hamoed? So these are issues that Rav Shechter was willing to really stick his neck out and take a stand. And because of his stature in the United States, it carried weight. To the extent that I know for a fact that Rav Usha Weiss conducted several video conference calls with Rav Shechter to try to coordinate some of these Piskei Halacha, that they should both be on the same page. So some of these results happened and some didn't happen, but that's okay. But I see this as a wonderful, wonderful development that people of this stature, their stature, are willing to talk to each other with great mutual respect and try to bring this together. Now, I mentioned also the Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel, Rav Yitzchak Yosef, who's the son of the late Rav Avad Yosef Zatzal. Rav Yitzchak Yosef, for example, issued a psak yesterday that people who are in quarantine, in bidud, in the days of the 3 weeks and the 9 days. So, you can go meshuga in bidud. You can go a little crazy. It's a psychologically a stifling place, putting it mildly, claustrophobic for some people. So what could ease the pressure and the stress would be music. So many of us are, big tzaddikim. In the 3 weeks, we do not listen to music, at least music of simcha. But Rav Yitzchak Yosef said that if you happen to be in a scenario of bidud and you're really under stress and you need the music as a therapy of sorts to calm you down, so just put the radio on, put the tape on, put the disc on, and just unwind with the music. And I thought that was very courageous of him and very correct. There's no doubt that was very, very correct. And just today, I received a question from a woman who attends one of the shiurim that I give at the OU Center. And her question was very simple. Some people, because of Corona, are excessively doing laundry. They're laundering their clothing every time they come home. Now, the Ministry of Health never said we have to do this, but there are some people who have taken upon themselves, let's call it a chumrah, an added stringency in the days of Corona. And the question was, what about the 9 days? We don't do laundry. And again, Rav Shechter came out with a public psak and said that any type of laundry that's corona-related, everybody will have to draw their conclusions what corona-related laundry means, but if you feel it's corona-related, then you can go about doing your laundry, because we are in a unique situation. And these things have to be said. And instead of people groping in the darkness or perhaps doing the wrong thing, so you have Rabbanim today who are one step ahead of the game and coming out with decisions that would help people get through this particular complicated and difficult time. I would like to just conclude by saying that the idea of Geulat Torah as we call an end game and a result, a goal in itself, should be very much part and parcel of our Tisha B'Av experience, and to a certain degree, that's why it was scheduled that the Shabbat right after Tisha B'Av, we're going to read the Aseret HaDibrot all over again from Parshat V'Etchanan every single year. It works out like that, so that Am Yisrael understands that just like there were problems in the desert, there was the shattering of the Luchot on the 17th of Tammuz, but there was a resolution to that with the Psolacha Shnei Luchot Avanim Karishonim. There was the second set of the tablets. And according to some commentators, the text of the second tablets was precisely what we're going to read on Shabbat of Ve'etchanan. So we will move into that positive, very positive period of time of consolation, of נחama, and the Kadosh Baruch Hu grant us that it should be the end of all tzara. Macha Hashem Elokim dim'a me'al kol panim, and Am Yisrael will be showered with the light of Torah forever and ever. Thank you.
Amen. Amen.
Yes, Rav Adler, we had one question on the chat.
Yeah.
Somebody want to know if you can say a few words about fasting on Tisha B'Av if you have serious medical problems or even related to Corona.
Okay, I'm willing to accept questions on the phone on a one-to-one basis with regard to fasting on Tisha B'Av. I don't think it would be wise to have an open check on the air because these are very personalized things. I would have to hear what the medical issue